This movie is about the chart axis. We're going to talk about all the settings we have and the options for the settings for the vertical axis, and then take a look at the horizontal axis where we have additional settings as to the axis type, whether it's text or a date type axis. So I've got two different data sets here. I've got one that spans from 1991 to 2007 that has the total labor force in terms of headcount and the total number of people that are employed above the age of 15. The difference between those two would infer the unemployment rate. And then the other data set has to do with a range of numbers. They're random numbers, but they're associated with a given date. And some of the dates in that sequence of dates are missing. So I'm going to select the first region of data and press F11 to create a chart on its own chart sheet. Now there's a couple of potential issues with this chart, and some of it's in the eye of the beholder, but the vertical axis has a lot of zeros. The labels are in millions. It runs from 0 to 180 million. There aren't any data points between 160 and 180 million, so that is sort of wasted space. If the focus is to determine the difference between these two series of numbers, the total labor force and the total employment, to sort of visually display or infer the unemployment rate, that's a little bit difficult to do and determine the trend of the changes between those two numbers because the columns are so long. And the difference between those two numbers is not accentuated. It's not the primary focus of this chart. So we can do a number of things to change those aspects and a few other things. But the first thing I'm going to do is get rid of the grid lines. I'm going to select no line and say OK. And then the next thing I'm going to do is double click one of the axis labels, the vertical axis labels, where we now have a Format Axis dialog box, and we have a number of options that we can start adjusting this axis with, beginning with the minimum and maximum. That minimum and maximum setting by default is 0 to 180 million. The 180 million is in scientific notation, but that's what it is. Determines the scaling of the data points and how they're plotted in a plot area on the chart. We can change that, though. Instead of beginning at 0, we can begin at 120 million because there are no data points that are below 120 million. We can also end at 160 million. The next pair of options that we have to do with the major units and the minor units. The major units is set at 20 million. Again, it's scientific notation, but that's what that designates. So we advance the labels on the axis by 20 million. We start at 120, go to 140, and finally end at 160. I'm going to change that to 10 million. And finally, we have a minor unit that looks like it's set to 40 million, and I'm going to change that to 5 million. And then I'm going to click off of that. We didn't really see anything happen yet because that minor unit amount that we've established, 5 million, actually doesn't have any impact until you add some tick marks, which we're going to do in a minute or two. So I'm going to leave that alone, those settings alone. I've adjusted those things. The next option that we have is a checkbox. We can completely flip-flop this chart, and since we're dealing with the vertical axis, when we flip-flop the numbers, where the low number, 120 million, is at the top of the chart, and the larger number, the upper end of the scale, is at the bottom of the chart is plotted sort of in reverse. This may be an effect that you might want to use at some point. I'm not sure it works well for the data that we're currently dealing with here. Next, we have the option to set the scale to be a logarithmic scale, which by default has a base of 10. That's the same sort of way the Richter scale is determined, where 7.0 on the Richter scale is actually 10 times the magnitude of a 6.0. So if you're dealing with a vast range of values, you might want to change it to a logarithmic scale. But if we change our current data to a logarithmic scale, everything is scaled on the axis where the label says 120 million or slightly higher, because the next axis label would be 1.2 billion, and none of our data points are anywhere near that magnitude. So I'm going to clear that checkbox. Next, we have the option to change the units that are displayed on the chart. And because we have so many zeros, because it's all millions, it might make sense to show these numbers in millions. And when we do that, Excel automatically displays the unit of measure that's being used. We can clear that checkbox and get rid of that label. That's probably not a good idea. The next pair of options have to do with the tick marks. We currently have tick marks showing on the chart. They are outside of the plot area. We can change that to none, and the tick marks near each one of the labels on the axis disappears. We can change it to inside, where they're drawn inside the plot area, outside like they were when we started, or we can do on both sides. The minor tick mark. This is where the minor unit comes into play. We define the minor unit to be 5 million, so we should see a tick mark on the inside, the plot area, in between each one of those axis labels. It's smaller than the other tick marks because it's a minor tick mark, and again we can put it inside or outside or cross right through the axis and put it on both sides. Next, we have the option to change the placement of or get rid of the axis labels. The default is to have the axis labels near the axis. That makes sense. We can move the axis labels to the high position. And what is that? Well, we're at the low position because our range of data runs from 1991 to 2007. The high position is 2007, which would make the low position where we were before, 1991, and we have the option to clear those axis labels completely, which is also probably not a good idea. So I'm going to put it back to next to the axis. And finally, we have some control over the placement of the horizontal axis and where it crosses the vertical axis. So again, just to remind where we are, we're dealing with the settings for the vertical axis. We just had the ability to change the location of the vertical axis. Now we have the ability to change the location of the horizontal axis. So I'm going to left click, and it's set by default at 0. I'm going to set it at 140 million. And when I enter that, I get sort of an interesting look here. This may work for some situations, it may not. It infers that the numbers below the axis are negative, and in fact, in this case, they're obviously not. And double-clicking and going back to the Format Axis dialog box, I have alternatively the ability to set it at the maximum. And in this case, since we're dealing with the placement of the horizontal axis on the vertical axis, the maximum value on the vertical axis is 160. So we've imposed a number of adjustments on this chart, and I'm going to close this dialog box. And we've sort of distorted the chart so that it infers something different than what maybe is actually happening. Since the vertical axis numbers run from low to high, the longer columns on this chart reflect the lower numbers. So as the columns decrease in size, they reflect a larger number, which is the opposite intuitively of what people would anticipate that is shown on a chart. So in order to fix that, we've got to show the values in the default order, and then we can also flip-flop the placement of the horizontal axis and get a more intuitive visual display for the underlying data. So I'm going to close this dialog box, delete this chart, and go back to our data and create another chart by pressing F11. And Excel has correctly determined that the horizontal axis data type are dates. And I know that because it has inserted some dates that I didn't have in my data initially, like the 3rd of January. If I go back to the worksheet, I have the 2nd of January, and then I have the 4th of January, but I don't have the 3rd of January. Excel has inferred that date because we all know it actually happened, and it plots it on the horizontal axis. So I'm going to double-click the horizontal axis to bring up the Format Axis dialog box for the horizontal axis. Most of these settings are just like the vertical axis. We have the ability to control the minimum and maximum, which sets the scaling for the axis. We can control the major unit, which defines the point at which the axis is labeled. We can define the minor unit, which will drive where the tick marks are displayed. And because we're dealing with dates, when we make a change to the major unit, minor unit, we can define that to be in terms of days, months, or years. And the base unit we can define in terms of days, months, or years as well. It wouldn't make sense in this case to change from days to months or years because we only have 2 weeks worth of data here. Just like with the vertical axis, I can flip-flop the horizontal axis and reverse the order of the dates. And next, we have some options that are associated with the horizontal axis and not the vertical axis. Because the horizontal axis is the category axis. The vertical axis is where we plot the values for each one of those categories. The default is to have Excel automatically select the type based on the data, which is what it did. The data was dates. Excel plotted dates and made this a date type. So when I change the radio selection to date axis, nothing happens because it's already a date axis. But when I change to a text axis, a lot happens. Excel treats each one of these dates as a separate category and ignores the fact that there may be, or in this case, there are days that are missing in the sequence and series of dates, and just plots the chart as if each one of those days was just another regular category. And when we choose the text axis data type, we have a couple other settings that we can change. The interval between tick marks is set at 1, which doesn't mean there's one tick mark in between the dates. It means that we put a tick mark in between each sequential advancing of the dates. So we can change that to, instead of a tick mark every 1 day, change it to a tick mark every 2 days. And I need to click off of that to get that to happen. It's a subtle change, but now we have January 1st, January 2nd, and then a tick mark, and then 2 more days, and then another tick mark, and so on. We can also change the interval unit, which will define how often we have a data label. I'm going to change that to 2 as well. And I'm going to click off of that. And we get rid of half of the data labels. Again, we can flip-flop the categories to have them be shown in reverse order. And below that, we have a distance setting. And what that does is move the plot area away from the labels on the horizontal axis. So I'm going to change that to 300. And we see the plot area provide some additional space for those labels. Moving on, as like the settings for the vertical axis, we can set the major tick mark, the minor tick mark, and the placement of those tick marks. We can change the placement of the axis labels next to the axis, high, low, and none, which is probably almost never a good idea. We can change the placement of where the vertical axis crosses the horizontal axis. And since we're dealing with categories, because we have defined these dates to be text, we have a number here. Otherwise, we'd see a date. I'm going to click off of that, and we change the placement of the vertical axis. Just to show you what that looks like, if we instead select date, we see the date as being a value that we determine where the vertical axis crosses the horizontal axis. Going back to the text axis, the last thing we can do, the last setting we can change, is to reposition the placement of the columns in relation to the labels. The default is to plot the columns between the tick marks, but since those tick marks represent the occurrence of a date, we might want to place those columns right on the tick marks. What that does is give you a split column, or a half of a column, on the far left side and the far right side of the graph. But that's the price you pay when you align the column, in this case it's a column chart, with the category label, which in this case is a given date. So that's the vertical and horizontal axis settings. We saw that the settings were the same or similar in almost all cases for both axes. We could set the minimum and maximum value, which determines the scaling. We could set the major unit, which determines how frequently we're going to label the axis. We could set the minor unit, which determines where the tick marks are going to be displayed, should we have tick marks displayed. We can reverse the order of the axis labels, which reverses the plotting of the data. For the horizontal axis, we can set the data type to be either text or date. We can set tick marks on both of the axes. We can change the placement of the labels on the axes, and we can get rid of the labels completely. We can determine where the vertical axis crosses the horizontal axis and where the horizontal axis crosses the vertical axis. And finally, for the horizontal axis, the category axis, we can determine where the columns are drawn. In this case, it's a column chart in relation to the category labels, in between or right dead on the category labels.